Hi there and welcome to Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. My name is Ian Willoughby. Our guest in episode 72 is Matt Field, the relatively new UK ambassador to Prague. Since taking over in January, he has, with skillful use of social media and visible eagerness to learn, quickly established himself as one of the best-known diplomats in the country. But how has Matt Field actually been finding life here in the Czech capital? And what are his priorities as London's man in Prague? They're just a couple of the things I discussed with him for this episode of Prague Talk. Reading your CV, one thing jumped out at me, and that is that you worked for the World Cup Organising Committee in Japan in 2002. How did that come about?
Yeah, I mean, it was an amazing experience. So I was very lucky in that I was in the right place at the right time. After I graduated from university, I went and worked in Japan for a couple of years. I taught, coached rugby as well. And then 2002 came around and they were looking for people who spoke Japanese and were going to be available for a few months. So I got picked up. I went to go and run one of their ticket offices in a place called Sendai. And of course, got to see some games, got to see this amazing experience actually of the country hosting and kind of opening up to the outside world for the first time. It was great.
Did you go to the notorious, I guess from the English fans' point of view, game where Ronaldinho embarrassed Seaman?
No, I didn't go to that one. And it was, quite a traumatic experience for all of us that were watching. I did get to go to the final, which was amazing. So I got to see Brazil and peak Ronaldo, the original Ronaldo.
The real Ronaldo.
At his best, the real Ronaldo at his best, which was fantastic as well.
You became British ambassador to Prague in January. What's the process of preparing to take the post? What kind of homework do you have to do before arriving at a posting?
And the first thing is, obviously, I was incredibly pleased to get the job. We have sort of an internal competition process. My wife and I were really keen on, in particular on Prague and this job, this opportunity. And so when we got that, we're just incredibly excited. So I instantly ran out and bought every book on Prague and the Czech Republic that I could get my hands on. We also sat down early and had a chat with my predecessor, Nick, and his partner, Erica, to try to understand a bit more the practical side of what it was going to be like. And then I had time when I finished in Sarajevo. I had a few months to get started on learning Czech. It's the best thing and the worst thing about my job is, trying to learn a language at my age from scratch is really hard work, but it's an amazing opportunity. So had the chance to get started at least on Czech, and I'm still having Czech lessons. Even this morning I was having another Czech lesson.
Well, you've impressed many people with your Czech skills so far and arrived with very decent Czech. Did the fact that you already spoke, I'm presuming Serbo-Croat, help you or even also hinder you in some way?
On some days it helps. The grammar is very similar, the kind of the structures underneath, some of the words are the same, but it can also really confuse. The pronunciation is very different. I think Czech is pretty tough, actually, the pronunciation. And sometimes the words mean exactly the opposite of what you think they're going to mean. So there's a lot of kind of false friends in there. But by and large, I think it probably helps more than it hinders. And now as I spend more time here, as I find more opportunities to practice Czech, I'm beginning to make some progress. But yeah, it's not an easy language, as you know yourself.
Very well. You were keen to come to Prague, as you say. What has been the reality so far compared to your expectations or hopes?
Some things we can genuinely say the experience is even better than we'd expected. People have been fantastically welcoming. It's an incredibly livable city. I love the public transport system. As a family, we use it to get around everywhere. People have been very generous with their kind of tips and suggestions on what we should be doing here. It's a great family-friendly city as well. We're here with two boys, 10 and 12. So that side has been really positive. I think one of the things that maybe has changed since I applied for the job compared to the job today is that Ukraine. I mean, Ukraine has basically, what happened on the 24th of February, what started then, has completely transformed, I think, the last 12 months of the relationship between our two countries and a lot of the work that I do. It's made it more interesting. It's made the relationship stronger. But it kind of increases, I think, the starting point as I began this job and the process of stepping into those big shoes that Nick had left.
But also the Czechs and the British are relatively strong supporters of Ukraine in the European context. Does that make your job easier?
Yeah, I think that's very true on both sides. So UK and the Czech Republic have had very similar responses. I think both countries understood very quickly what was at stake, that this wasn't about some isolated problem for one European country, but actually there's a lot more at play. And in particular, this was an attack on a democratic, sovereign, independent country, and we all stood to lose if they're allowed to do that. I think we'd also had domestic experiences which influenced us. So we had Salisbury. Here in the Czech Republic, it was Vrbětice. I think it's kind of an awakening moment for both of us. And then we have just been working very closely together throughout that. So in some ways it makes it easier, but it also means that there's even more to do. And the kind of level of interest in the UK now is much higher than it's ever been.
President Zelensky says that peace can only be agreed if Ukraine regains all of its territory, but also that the Ukrainians want reparations and war crimes tribunals. Surely that kind of victory is virtually impossible. What would be an acceptable outcome from the British perspective?
Yeah, I think that's the really big question right now. But it's fundamentally a question for the Ukrainian people. So they are the ones who will have to decide exactly what success looks like. They are the ones who will have to judge the point at which they're ready to sit down and discuss all of those issues. Our job as friends of the Ukrainian people is to help them get to that point. So make sure they have what they need to be successful now. That's military support, humanitarian, other areas of assistance. It's also helping on things like war crimes, as you mentioned there. And I have a history of work in the Western Balkans, a large amount of which was sort of dating back to the conflicts of the 90s. And war crimes investigations, making sure that justice is reached, is incredibly important for a country to be able to move on. So that balance, giving them what they need now, and then also letting them take the decisions as to what success looks like.
Your predecessor, Nick Archer, was sitting in that same seat a few months ago, and he said that his term as ambassador was all about Brexit. Are you still having to explain Brexit, or do you feel like we've already got past that point?
As Nick was sat here explaining this, I was down the road in Sarajevo covering many of the same issues, actually, and explaining and making sure that my hosts in Bosnia understood that this didn't mean less of the UK. If anything, actually, it probably meant more, and we followed up on that. We delivered, I think, more over those 4 years. It's going to be less a part of my job than it was for Nick, because I think more of those issues have been tackled. The framework that was reached in Windsor, the agreement about how to handle issues on the island of Ireland, that I think is good reason to be optimistic about where we go next, the relationship between the UK and the EU. I think also Ukraine, again, has changed it. So I think such a direct threat to European security has cleared away any doubts that the UK and EU need to work together. We have to. And so I'm hoping it's going to be less of a contentious part of the job here, but it still will be. It still be an important part of it.
What does a diplomat do or an ambassador do in a situation where your country has like 3 prime ministers in 2 months, and you have to explain that, and you're probably getting a lot of attention from local media wherever you are? What do you do in that kind of situation?
It's important to remember ambassadors in our system, diplomats are civil servants. So we're there to serve the government of the day. And yeah, last year was pretty turbulent. I don't think we've seen anything quite like it. One of the, I suppose, challenges, in some ways an advantage actually, is that people know what's going on in the UK very well. Media follow very closely. There's great correspondence based in London. There's an awful lot of coverage. So I don't generally have to explain what's happening in the UK in terms of the basic kind of facts and details. People generally are much more interested in what it means for them. Okay. What do those changes of different senior positions mean for the relationship here, let's say? And actually, we saw Prime Minister Truss came here for the European political community meeting. We saw her come here as Foreign Secretary as well. We have seen a level of kind of increased engagement. Yesterday, I was in London with Minister Rakushan to take forward some of the next levels of cooperation around law enforcement. So we're doing more together, and I think that's the kind of key question that people ask. Okay, so what does it mean for us? What does it mean for the relationship? Are you too distracted at home to do the work here? And I think we've shown that we're not, but you'll continue to get those questions, and that's fine. That's part of the job.
What is London most interested in when it comes to Czechia? What aspects of politics or society here are you kind of tracking most?
The kind of areas now I think that the UK cares about here is what we can do together. I mean, Ukraine is still top of the list. What we can do together on security issues, law enforcement, so work against the new and emerging threats, so things like cybercrime. How do we together tackle child exploitation online? What can we do about increased sort of organised crime threats around the region and the interconnectedness that we have across the UK? So that's the kind of safer bit. Then there are activities around what I think of as the more prosperous. So what are we going to do to make our two countries more prosperous? How do we increase trade even further? It was up 13% last year to £9 billion a year. I think we can do better. Investments in both directions, scientific cooperation, things like that. Then there's the sort of more resilient piece as I think about it. And this is where I keep coming back to the idea of values. So it's the fact we're both democratic, open countries with free media, and we want to protect those democratic processes. And frankly, those are under attack. And we see that at home in the UK, disinformation, direct attacks against the democratic process. And between those three sort of pillars, I think we cover an awful lot of what is already a good relationship.
Given his pro-Western stance and his NATO background, I presume the UK government welcomed the election of Petr Pavel as new Czech president.
Yeah, so we literally welcomed it, and that we said congratulations to him. I was really pleased to bring a message from King Charles III, a sort of personal message for President Pavel on his inauguration, to attend the inauguration as well. We know him well. We know him from his time chairing the NATO Military Committee and the handover he had with the UK representative, Lord Peach. He studied at our Royal College of Defence Studies. But I think what's really resonated for the UK and for many others as well is a very clear message from the new president about the democratic institutions. And I think in particular, he's been clear that he doesn't see the country as a bridge between East and West, but it's rooted in the institutions of NATO and the EU. And I think that's a very clear and useful message, particularly when we see the challenges that we've got at the moment.
Since your arrival, you have made a big impression on social media, with tweets racking up huge numbers of likes, including for a video that had something like over 1.5 million views. Is that kind of thing something that is expected of all British ambassadors now? It's
been a really positive response since I've started, which I appreciate a great deal. So I think it is part of the job these days. So every British ambassador around the world is expected to be active on traditional and social media. It's a tool. It's still no more than, say 10% of my job, but it's a fun 10%, and it's often the bit that people see most clearly. We have a great team in the embassy that gives me advice, and I think we also try to approach it in the way that, the advantage of social media is that you can have a conversation, so you can interact much more than with just traditional media. And that opportunity to ask questions, solicit inputs, get people's recommendations, but also get feedback.
One question you put out on Twitter was asking for film tips. Are there any particular Czech movies that you've seen since then that have made a big impression on you?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, again, it was a question, and I really didn't know whether people would respond. It was a huge number of recommendations. I think we had over 3,000 responses, and many of those were long lists of films, including actually from some directors of films, incredibly. And so I picked some of those to start with, some of the most popular ones. I started with Polishki, and I'm really glad that I did, because I think it's a way to help someone understand what that period during the 60s looked like from different perspectives. I watched The Cremator the first weekend, which is one of the strangest and most disturbing films I've seen in a long time. And some of the Foreman sort of classic Fireman's Ball and Loves of a Blonde. What I'm trying to do now is kind of make sure I'm sampling some of the more contemporary films as well, because there's a lot being made.
You've also been tweeting photos from your runs in Prague. Have you found a regular route, or are you actually using running to discover the city more?
Yeah, still using it to discover the city, to be honest. You've got some fantastic spaces here. So Stromovka and Letna, it's great. I love going up to Petržin, although it's hard work to get up the hill, running alongside the river. It's a way of kind of exploring a bit. I don't want to give people the impression I'm a super serious runner, because I'm not, but it's a nice way of staying active and also of exploring the city. And again, people have given me recommendations. Some recommendations I won't take up, marathons, Vltava runs. I think people are a bit too ambitious for me, but I really enjoy exploring it, and that goes for the rest of the city as well.
And you also get people recognizing you when you're out and about like that?
I do sometimes, yes. I've had a few comments of sort of stetu nove or something like that. I think also I probably don't blend in that well. I mean, my Irish heritage is very evident in my red beard, and so I don't think I get mistaken for other people very easily.
Many thanks to UK Ambassador Matt Field for joining me for Prague Talk. This has been episode 72 of the podcast, so there are, of course, loads more editions where this one came from. Why not try out a few and sign up wherever you get podcasts? For now, from me, Ian Willoughby, thanks for listening to Prague Talk, a podcast from Radio Prague International. Talk to you again very soon.